Okay, so hello everyone. You probably all know me either as Jamie or that arsehole, right? Yeah, emphatic nodding there. So yeah, I thought it would be good as such an incredible arsehole if I could give a talk on all of the ways that you can or can avoid being an arsehole. And apparently the screen's going to screw up loaded, so maybe that's not going to happen. There we go. Okay, so, oh wow, this is fancy. I did not know that what is that? Okay.
Neither office does that as well.
Okay, so yeah. Accessibility and inclusivity in games. So this is a pretty big topic. There's a lot that I'm going to try and cover. There's a lot that I won't be covering. This isn't exhaustive. It's more to just sort of get you to think about things. I think, yeah. So basically, you probably all know a lot of this stuff already. A lot of it is common sense, but knowing it and doing it are different things. You often, it's very easy to overlook a lot of this stuff or to just not think about it. So here's a few things that you should ask when you're making a game. Can you make your game as it is more inclusive? That's of various groups. Can you make it more accessible? Can you, if people had a certain disability, how could you cater to that disability and allow them to complete your game? And are you making assumptions about your players? Because the common assumption is going to be that the player is a white male, because that's just the industry, that's the way it is right now, and that's not really a good thing. At least I don't think so. So who plays games right now? There are lots of different numbers flying around. Here are a couple that I found. So teens, basically everyone, all teens play games. A surprising number maybe, well not surprising, but a large number of adults, and the ESA is a company that kind of emphasizes the aging population of gamers, the fact that you can't guarantee that or you can't expect your players to be young anymore. That's just not the truth. And you also shouldn't expect them to be old. Kids are going to play your games as well, so you should think about that. So a basic approximation would be everyone plays games. So what's the problem? Why do we need accessibility? Why do we need to improve our accessibility and inclusivity? Again, I said earlier, but the industry has a very specific demographic that it caters to, and a lot of indie games also cater specifically to that group and don't include any others. So many other groups will play games and feel that they are not the intended audience, and that they are somehow, I guess a good example was, I was reading about someone, a female gamer playing Fallout 3, saying that the game was great. The game did most things right. It screwed up a lot in that there were bugs where her character would be referred to as he, and in one of the ending sequences, the character was shown as male, so that was a big problem. But other than that, it was okay. But she said that when she went to a GameStop, she saw the box art for Fallout, she saw the back of the box, and she saw the posters, and all of the characters were male. They were, this quite stereotypical white male character that is sort of the ideal according to the industry. So that's a big problem. And finally, games frequently fail to address the needs of people with disabilities in the simplest ways. So, I mean, put on a personal note, like my mother is disabled, paralyzed on one side, and there are so many games where, oh, you know, my mum would love this game, but hang on, you actually need 2 hands to operate this game, and I can't see a reason for that. You know, there are games where that would be necessary for the mechanic, but there are other games where you kind of need 2 hands, and it's like, why? You know, they just didn't think of it. So I'm going to talk about accessibility first. Accessibility, again, big topic. A lot of the things that I'm going to cover might get 1 slide, could deserve an entire presentation on their own. But you know, the overarching points are that there are limitless disabilities, and you probably can't cater to all of them unless you're making a very simple game. I'm trying to kind of give things that will kind of make it easier for a wide range of people to play your game without difficulty, or without too much difficulty. What else? Yeah. So people with disabilities will play your game. I mean, Andy sent me a link about a blind kid who played all of The Legend of Zelda from start to finish by hitting his sword against a wall and hearing where he was. Okay. I read another article about someone with cerebral palsy who had finest motor control with their neck, and so would play would play with the mouse under their neck. You know, that people are eager to play games, whether they're disabled or not, and they will do what they can to play your games. So make it easy for them. Think about how you can allow them to play your games. And here's a very good definition of accessibility, I think, which is basically, you know, can someone complete your game, whether they're disabled or not? So spot the problem with this. Anyone? Rhiannon, you were first. Yep. Straight away. This is what you would see if you were if you had deuteranopia, which is the most common form of color blindness. Color blindness is really, really common. So this is normal color, clearly. This is the most common form of color blindness, deuteranopia, most common amongst men, and also protanopia. Both of these are forms of red-green colorblind. Finally, the rarest form is tritanopia, tritanopia, I don't know how to pronounce it. Basically, you should try to account for all of these. I mean, monochromacy is also not unheard of, and so an easy way of checking if your game is accessible to colorblind people is playing it in grayscale. There are other methods you can use. For example, default to orange and purple, not red and blue. Avoid red and blue like the plague, because people with the most common form of colorblindness cannot tell the difference. And that's a big, big problem. So avoid cyan, because if you have protanopia, this is a neutral point. You can't distinguish this point from white. And that, again, you know, someone without that form of colorblindness would not have a problem and would be completely unaware that there was a problem there. Allow players to choose the colors themselves. That way you can't screw up. You know, that can be a bit of programming, I guess, depending on how you're doing it, but it's worth it because you're making your game more accessible, and that should always be worth it. One thing I was going to say was we put loads of effort into targeting separate platforms, right? We put all of this work into targeting mobile devices or a certain type of computer, and that's great, and we should be doing that. Why do we not put the same focus on targeting these sorts of problems and making our games accessible in that way as well? So the final thing is display your game information symbolically. Don't rely on color alone to convey ideas. So here are a few tools that exist that I found. So Color Oracle is pretty good. It works on any platform that has Java, and it shows you a static image of your screen, so you can't actually test gameplay while you're doing it, which is a bit of a pain. The other one's Symbolically, which I don't know. It's on OS X and I couldn't test it. Maybe it's better. Maybe it gives you real-time stuff. I don't know. But yeah, can you play your game in black and white is a sort of a foolproof test. And then in GIMP, there's this display filters thing that actually has colorblind filters included, so you can check there as well. So moving on to other vision impairments, these are generally things that you can, mainly options. So making sure there's high contrast in your user interfaces, or giving that option. So adding audible cues can be really useful when you're scrolling down on something, letting someone know that they've moved on to the next menu item, things like that. Resizable UI text, high contrast option, text-to-speech. Text-to-speech is probably the hardest of those to implement. I don't know if I really expect people in 48-hour competitions to be adding text-to-speech to their games, but if you were making a much larger game, then it would definitely be something to consider if you had a lot of text. Now, blindness is a big issue for games. It's probably one of the hardest things that I can think of to actually cater for. But games based around music or sound alone, if you like those sorts of games, you should be thinking, what can I do with my user interface that means that not only people with perfect vision can enjoy this game, can you cater to blindness without compromising your game? And that statement applies to all disabilities. Is can you cater for it with your current game? So hearing impairments are actually probably less problematic for games, but they can still be a big problem, especially if you have voiced dialogue. So things like closed captions and not relying on sound alone to convey information. Basically, you should give people information and feedback in as many ways as you can, because then you're less likely to leave anyone unable to play. Motor and cognitive impairments, I've kind of grouped these together because while they are very different, their effects in games, or the ways you can solve these problems in games and make it easy for people with these impairments in games, are kind of similar, and there's a lot of overlap. So I've got a long list, so I don't actually know what comes next. Hold on. So yeah, simple UI interfaces. I think Assassin's Creed, the first Assassin's Creed, took 11 key presses or button presses to get back to the main menu, like to quit the game. That's kind of poor, and only big industry games can really afford to sort of exclude people in that way. You think like. So yeah, limit the number of controls in your game. There's a whole branch of games which Alan mentioned to me yesterday. Obviously, you see them about, but they already have a name. One-switch games, which are operated with a single button. So can your game be translated into one of them? Being able to map controls is probably the best thing you can do, because if someone can't play with your default control setup, but they can change it to something that they can play with, that's ideal. That's what you want. You should avoid controls which require two hands, as I've said, because some people just can't do that. And again, sometimes this is impossible. It's on a game by game basis. But you should think about it. Fast reaction times and simultaneous key presses, repetitive button presses. All of these things are bad for people with motor impairment and often cognitive impairments as well. yeah, I saw this suggestion in an article. You know, if you're going to have these sort of repetitive key presses, have an option in the settings menu, like, do you want to repeatedly tap, or do you want to hold the button? You know, which is better for you, because some people can do one and not the other. And the hardest suggestion is one that came up a lot, was actually having a speed setting in your game, which controls the master flow of time, so people can slow down the game to something that they can actually play. Then there's yeah, so that none of this means making the game easy. People, you know, people don't want to play easy games, or they don't want to play stupidly easy games, and there's no reason that you have to make your game really easy to cater to disabilities. You just have to try and make as many different ways you can that people can actually complete them. So here are some one-switch games, and these websites, the first website especially, have pretty much all the information that I just gave, pretty much all of it, and more, and in a nicer layout. So, you know, if you want to make games that are more accessible, you should check out gameaccessibility.org. I think that was the best one. And then the second one has a list of research papers and all sorts of stuff on making games accessible. So while on the topic of accessibility, this sort of approaches both sections, but trigger warnings. So I don't know if many of you or any of you know trigger warnings. You see them about online. Some people have taken to mocking trigger warnings, but what a trigger warning is when someone has post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from an event in their life. You put that, like, that can be triggered by sometimes the simplest, most innocuous things. So a sound or someone saying something, you know, can trigger someone with post-PTSD. And PTSD I'm not sure what it's like, I don't have it, but I've been told that it, you know, you relive the event as though you were there, and it can be an absolutely terrifying experience. If you're making a game and it deals with topics that could trigger people, you should tell them. You should put a warning on your game. So here are a few common things that you will put trigger warnings on. Anorexia and eating disorders, I'm not sure that relates to PTSD, but certainly I've read that people with eating disorders, or who have survived eating disorders, who then read about various eating disorder related material, can end up regressing, and you know, so there are other things. So, and as a content note for things that just discuss these problems as well, you know, not just representing them, just talking about them. So no matter how good your game is, no matter, you know, if it deals with these issues, then it's probably quite a serious game. And you know, no matter how well you deal with these issues or how great your game is, if 1,000 people enjoy or 100,000 people enjoy your game, and one person has to relive a rape for that, that's not worth it, really, is it? So the final warning with the final message with trigger warnings is, it's better safe than sorry. If you're not sure if you should include a trigger warning, you probably should, because you know, nobody's going to complain, or nobody is seriously going to complain because you put a warning that wasn't necessary. So now moving on to inclusivity, which is maybe a slightly more contentious topic, but I hope not. So what can I say about inclusivity? A lot of inclusivity related issues come from making assumptions about your players. Now, I think we all make assumptions about our players. The assumption is normally that we're the players. You know, I'm the person that's going to play my game. The problem with making that assumption is it will then come true. You will be the only person that plays your game. which nobody wants, right? So inclusivity, the first thing is forget realism. You know, don't say, oh well, realistically this group or that group wouldn't be in this situation, wouldn't be in this setting, because if you have a character that flies and fires lasers out of his eyes, then you've sort of abandoned realism at the door, and most games will break with realism in one way. Why not make it a good way? And here's a more controversial statement, something that quite a lot of people say, don't have, ignore that target, don't have white, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual, male main characters, because if I wanted to play a game with a character that was all of those things, I could get every game that's ever been made, put them in a huge hat, reach in, pick one at random, and I'd probably get what I was after. There are enough of those already. I mean, you know, I'm not saying that that's true, but it's something to think about. So one way of being inclusive is copying out. Don't, you know, games, we have this, we have the luxury in games that games are kind of at their simplest, they're a mechanism that people operate to achieve a goal. You don't actually need characters in games. You know, you should always think, does this game actually require a character to be fun or to be meaningful? So games don't need characters. And games that do have characters or need characters don't necessarily need anthropomorphic characters. A great way of including everyone is not including anyone. But, you know, that's not always going to work. That's probably not usually going to work. Most games will probably require anthropomorphic characters because, you know, human nature, we like to see humans, we like to be, you know, it's just a natural thing. But so there are three options if you have anthropomorphic characters. For the main character, this fits on main characters. So you can have your fixed main character. Now I would avoid that if you can. The only time that's really absolutely necessary is when traits and properties of that character are necessary for the plot or storyline of your game. So if that's not the case, then you should probably try to be a bit more inclusive than whatever group happens to be your main character. So then you can have a character selection screen, and you know, that can be fine, especially if you want multiple characters that all have intricate backstories or whatever. Loads of games do that. Finally, games like Terraria will, you know, give you complete character customization. You get to set everything about your character, and that's great in the games that it works in. Again, it doesn't work in every game. You kind of have to have a game that doesn't, you know, where either it doesn't have a story, or the main character doesn't necessarily have any sort of, is sort of extraneous to the story, just sort of a witness to the story. So that's
there's a quick exception, I think, of a case where it does. You can have a character customized very much and still have a significant impact. The Mass Effect series generally does very well.
I was actually going to mention Mass Effect being awesome for that. But yes, BioWare in general are really on it when it comes to that sort of thing. And what never mind. So there's a side note here, which is user-generated content, whether it's a character customization, is always great. It's great not only because people like to make stuff, but also because if your game isn't very inclusive, people can just make it inclusive by making things for it that are inclusive. On the other hand, most of the games we make are very small and crappy, and user generation is really hard. So, you know, I think it's understandable not doing that, but you know, whatever. It's something to think about. So, what's the problem with this? Well, and the good thing, I guess. The good thing is fairly easy. Anyone want to say what the problem is? No? Okay, this is the default character model. This is what you see when you start up that when you start a new character in Terraria, and he's pretty white and he's pretty male, and Terraria has all of these color bars and all of these things that you can change, and it seems really stupid. It has a randomize button. It's there at the bottom of the list. Why do you have a default? Why not just hit randomize? Like, why does the game not randomize for you? And in character selection screens as well, why is it always the white male character that is the first person that you see? You know, imagine, I mean, almost everyone here is male. Imagine that every time you played a game, you had to scroll back in the character selection screen to find the person that represented you. I mean, that's a really small thing, right? But it kind of sends a message. It says what the people that made this game expected. It makes an assumption about your main player base. And I mean, so how many people, how many men have made games with main female characters? Ben. How many white people have made games with main characters that are people of color? I mean, I was going to answer first, but Ben beat me to it. I've made one game that almost meets either of those criteria, and it doesn't really. So, you know, apparently...
I made a game where you play as a black square.
That's great. I mean, you know, copping out, but I mean that's one way of thinking of it. But yeah, copping out is good. Like, yeah, that was what I was gonna say. I didn't say that, but on the copping out slide, like when it comes to non-anthropomorphic characters, you can be a black square, you can be a spider, you can be a genderless robot. It doesn't matter. Like there are all these different characters you can be, and you know, humans are boring, right? But anyway. So is it a problem that we're not making games that feature more women or more people of color? Well, you know, there's $158,000 of this is a problem. Like, and if that wasn't enough, I mean, you know, if the amazing support that Feminist Frequency got wasn't enough to convince you this was a problem, the backlash should convince you that it was a problem. The first time I ever heard about Anita Sarkeesian was someone calling her a bitch. And the second time I heard about Anita Sarkeesian was someone in the Ludum Dare IRC who said, this woman is nuts. Someone else, completely unprompted, then came in and said, feminist frequency? There are lots of problems, and I don't have time to talk about all of them, but you know, that's something to think about. So when it comes to sexism, there are a few really quick, simple things you can think about when you're making games with storylines. The first is the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test specifies that something passes the Bechdel test if it has two female characters who at some point talk to each other about something that isn't a man. Okay, that sounds really simple. The first 3 Star Wars films don't pass the Bechdel test. Lots of films don't pass the Bechdel test. Lots of games don't pass the Bechdel test. Now, Bechdel test, the Bechdel test's applications to games is a little bit dubious sometimes. You know, it doesn't always apply. People have sort of talked about how we can adjust the Bechdel test to make it better, but you know, it is a problem. But it's if you're doing a game with a storyline, something to think about. The Mako Mori test is a sort of a newer version, which was actually a response to Pacific Rim, which only had one female character, but that female character had her own story arc, and it was totally unrelated to any of the men in the film. At least it wasn't for the furtheration of their plot arcs. So people made a new version of the Bechdel test, or not even a replacement, something to go alongside the Bechdel test. Which, you know, you think if you make games with characters, 51% of people are female, right? So probably 51% of your games with characters should pass the Mako Mori test. Okay, next slide. Now, I can't really say much about this that Feminist Frequency doesn't say, and I would strongly advocate watching those videos. So there are lots of very negative tropes in pop culture. The damsel in distress one is the one that's most relevant to games. It's probably most common in games in terms of all media. And again, why does a male character have to rescue a female character? Why does the character that gets rescued have to be female? Why does the character that rescues them have to be male? It also, Feminist Frequency says a lot about this being sort of female as reward, objectifying women, all of this stuff, bad stuff. But yeah, again, better to watch the Feminist Frequency videos where she covers it in extremely great detail. The next thing that I wanted to cover was fridging. That comic on the right is Green Lantern, which is where this trope gets its name. The main character gets a note: "I left a surprise for you in the fridge." It's from his girlfriend, supposedly. He opens the fridge, and his dismembered girlfriend's body is inside. And this has become a really common trope. What it means is killing a woman to further a man's story arc. Now, that actually sounds like a really weird thing, right? I mean, you wouldn't think that was normal, but it comes up everywhere. I don't know if anyone watches Supernatural, but it happens in that a lot. It's kind of famous for it. Men with boobs. Now, this is something I wanted to highlight for a couple of reasons. This is the name that Feminist Frequency is giving to this video that she's going to do. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be about female characters who are really just masculine, sort of male characters, but who have almost had a texture pack applied to them. And I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that if there was a range of different female characters, but when that's the only kind of female character that gets represented, it's a bit stupid. Because people shouldn't have to be masculine to be main characters. People shouldn't have to appeal to some masculine ideal. But the reason I wanted to highlight this is, this is the name that Anita Sarkeesian's giving to this. And it's actually transphobic because there are men with boobs. There are people that are born female who identify as men. So that is actually marginalizing of them. So that's, I think that's a good example of even the people that are really on it and who really know their stuff can screw up sometimes. And I want to talk about that a bit more later. So there are many more, and there are a couple of places you can go to find out more horrific tropes that will depress you. So the next slide. Spot the problem or spot the difference. Either one. Both from the same game. I'm going to move on because I'm not sure what the rules on pornography are, but so sexualization is kind of bad in all games, and it's awful if you only do it to female characters. It's bad anyway if you're doing it evenly, unless you're making a pornographic game, which, if you want to do that, fine. Be even about it, but whatever. So why is this so bad? It limits the age range of your game to adults and adolescent boys, I guess, and excludes players that aren't comfortable with that sort of imagery. That people do exist that don't like that sort of thing. I'm one of them. I'm not a big fan of playing games that have sexualized characters, and it limits where you can play this game and who you can play it with. I mean, I probably wouldn't want to be showing a game that had horrendously sexualized characters to my mum. Probably not, even if it was really good. So okay. So race and ethnicity. Again, this is sort of something everyone will know. Everyone will know how to not screw this up. But it's, again, something that people maybe don't necessarily think about when they're making their games. And so it's something to, don't have a whitewashed cast. Don't just have white characters. If you're going to have a character selection screen, I'd say that this is the minimum you have to do to actually, sort of include, or show that you're trying to include everyone, even though there are going to be other ethnicities that aren't going to be included. Sometimes there is going to be a limit, and I think this is probably the minimum. Although again, 48-hour competitions throw everything out the window, but maybe don't have a white main character in that case. If you're gonna, but don't use it as an excuse, basically. Now, if you're going to have a specific setting, you should probably research the indigenous peoples in that region or any ethnic minorities that that live there, because there's nothing quite says exclusion like setting a game in, say, or let's say the Frozen film, setting a film in Scandinavia and not covering a major sort of ethnic minority in that region. I don't know if anyone heard about that, probably not, but it was a big deal in certain places. And avoid stereotypes. There are lots of reasons you should avoid stereotypes. And I think they've got a whole slide to themselves. So racial stereotypes are the most normalized. Like, for some reason, while racist speech is the worst thing and homophobic speech is probably the most acceptable thing in terms of what's normal in society, it's kind of reversed when it comes to stereotypical characters. And stereotypes in general, so stereotypes are not progressive. You're not helping if you're including only stereotypical characters. Maybe stereotypes have a place, but only, I think on the side I've got a link to an article where someone says the Coltrane on his own would be fine, but he's the only character you ever see. He's the only black character you ever see. That stereotype is so pervasive. It kind of says that actually, white characters get to be interesting, but no one else does. They just they're a stereotype, and that's terrible as well. So yeah, I personally think that when including marginalized groups, a stereotype is more harm than good. Maybe people would disagree with me on that. I don't know. And that kind of leads on to memes, because stereotypes are a type of meme, a bit lighter than everything else that I've mentioned so far. But yeah, in a creative medium, memes are unacceptable because they denote a lack of creativity. That's what a meme is. It's being unable to have ideas of your own, almost. Tropes can be tools, but memes are normally opt-outs. They're kind of saying, well, I couldn't be bothered to be funny or clever here, so I'm going to borrow someone else's funniness or cleverness. They're very exclusive. Like, you're basically saying, do you get the joke? Yes, no. And if you don't, then you don't. And that, that's not good. Again, I kind of went on a rant here because I really hate memes. I don't know if that comes through. And they limit the shelf life of your game to the shelf life of the memes that you include, right? That's kind of not a good idea. Like, I think someone made a really, really good game, but they started it with a meme, and I thought, well, in 10 years from now, I'm gonna play that game, and I'm gonna go, what is this? Why is the name all weird? So moving on, what's right with this picture, and who recognizes it? Yeah, so you got 3 guesses. Heteronormativity. You will see a lot of this in video games and everything else. That's why it's called normative. It's the idea of making heterosexual and traditional relationships seem not only normal and not only assuming that that is the way that everyone is, but also kind of implying that that's the way people should be. And there are lots of other options. I mean, LGB is the one that should come to mind. There are other sexualities, well, omni and pansexuality are, I think, synonymous, and polysexuality is slightly different. So pansexuality is essentially not to do with gender, not to do with bisexuality is considered sort of having a sexuality in the gender binary, whereas pansexuality and polysexuality are actually saying, regardless of the anatomy of the problem, it's not what's important to you. And there are two techniques, and this applies to lots of things. Two techniques for sort of including non-heteronormativity in your games. Either don't make a fuss of it. Don't make a fuss that a character is gay. Mention it or have it, made clear in some way, but don't harp on about it. Don't make it a plot point. Don't say this person is gay and that means that they have to have a whole plot arc about how they're gay, because that doesn't say that it's normal. That says that it's different. The other way is kind of the Samus Aran technique of have a character that the white heterosexual male player plays and gets to know and kind of thinks, yeah, really cool guy, and then it's, oh, and they're gay. Surprise. Like Samus Aran, you play the first game and you think, oh, they're strong, they've got a gun, they must be a man, right? And the joke's on you. So that's one way of doing it. Alternatively, you can deal with issues that arise from these things, but again, I'm just talking about inclusivity, not sort of dealing with the big issues that are around these things. So the next slide. What's the problem here?
Do you know any select one at a time?
What was that?
You can only select one at a time?
It's kind of enforcing the gender binary.
Yes, it really is. And not everyone identifies with one or either of those. Also, I mean, this is maybe a finer distinction. Some people I know dislike male and female on checkboxes or select boxes or whatever because male and female are sexes, they're not genders. At least according to some people. I don't know how uniformly that position is held.
Do you think it's acceptable to have male, female, and other, where you can enter?
Other is either a radio button that just kind of says other options exist. You can have a text field where you can input the way that you identify. That's probably the best way.
You see that most of the time nowadays.
Yeah, but I think the thing to take away from this is, why are you asking? Is it important that you know? Why bother asking this question? We've kind of got this idea, oh, I'm making a form, I'm going to question a load of people. I should totally know what their sex or gender is, right? But why is that important?
Yeah, I did a psychology experiment for someone last week, and I saw they actually did have male, female, other, but I was just like, well, why is it important? It's completely orthogonal to your experience. Like male, female, it's just irrelevant.
Yeah. I kind of feel like there was something I forgot to say. Yeah, there was. So basically, I'm about to talk about trans people. Now, the thing about the first two groups I covered, women, people of colour, you're going to get at least token inclusivity, right? That's probably mandatory in all media now. With heteronormativity and trans people, it's not nearly as guaranteed. It's kind of it's quite unusual to see these groups in media represented in a non-stereotypical way. And so it's kind of impossible to say that this is mandatory or that you should definitely be doing this. But what it does do is it says to those groups, for one thing, the developer is, they know you exist. The developer knows that you exist. They are okay with that. They're trying to include you. They're trying to do everything they can to include you, and that's an important message to send, I think. And so, anyway, trans issues are many and varied and complicated, and I was almost not going to include them just because of that. And then I spoke to some people, and they said, you should include this. So, here's sort of a really quick rundown of some of the terms. So the gender binary, everyone should know. Sex is your anatomical arrangement, usually at birth, not your gender. Your gender is separate. And your gender identity is sort of the way that you define yourself within or without the gender binary, because people can identify outside of the gender binary. Gender expression, the way that you express yourself along gender lines, won't necessarily align with your gender identity, won't necessarily align with your sex. And transsexual is a term that people often use to refer to trans people, but it actually only specifically refers to people who opt to have sex reassignment surgery, and most people prefer the term transgender if they have gender dysphoria. So transgender is when someone's gender identity does not align with their sex. A transvestite is someone whose gender expression does not align with their sex or their gender identity, I think. I mean, some of these definitions people might argue with me about. I might be wrong about some of these things. Genderqueer means the gender identity does not fall within the gender binary, or at least doesn't fall neatly into male or female. Or man and woman. Gender fluidity, when the gender can change. Genderless, no gender, and there are more divisions than this. This is kind of a simplified version. And cisgendered, I used the term earlier, I don't know if everyone knows it. It means that you have the same gender identity as your born as sex. So those align. Now, the thing about all of these issues, these groups, this group of quite actually somewhat different people, is that the actual representation of this group in media is typically very bad, really very bad, and it's often kind of seen as sexual deviancy or perversion belonging to one of these groups, which is really weird. Because it denotes a complete lack of understanding of the issue. And things are getting somewhat better, I think, but it's still a long way from perfect. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, is because this group takes an incredible amount of shit. You would be amazed. I can think of quite a few things that have happened since the beginning of this year that have been terrible. So how can you try to include trans people in your games? So again, don't ask for the sex or gender unnecessarily, because it's probably not your business. So if you're going to have character customization, don't separate the clothing or whatever, anything, by the sex that person chooses, because it's normally not necessary. Like, you kind of have to add code to achieve that, not remove it. So include androgynous characters, because a transgendered person will probably play as their the gender that they identify with, or the sex that they identify with. But there are people that don't. And
can I just make a quick point about separating character clothing by sex? But I think the worst thing about that is a lot of RPGs have like a clothing item that looks completely different depending on who wears it. So you have like in Dragon Age you'll have like formal clothing 1,
Yeah.
And then on a man, it's like a suit, and on a woman, it's like a dress. And it's like, what are you doing? Just, that is unnecessary.
It also doesn't actually make any sense in the game because when you put on women's clothing, it doesn't magically turn into.
Exactly.
Wait, it doesn't? I'd also point out that, again, with the second main point there, Terraria does that pretty well as well, because like it gives you a choice of hairstyles, but doesn't care which gender you are when you are choosing.
Yeah, for sure.
I was Saints Row, which has a slide.
But Terraria also kind of has one set of clothing for men and one set of clothing for women. In fact, that's the only way that you differentiate your sex at all in that game.
They added a different voice.
Yes.
And that, yeah. And you can include trans characters in general. I mean, this is kind of why I was kind of a bit on edge about this, because I don't want the Gabe from Penny Arcades of the world making games with trans characters in it, because they will screw it up, and they will screw it up so badly that you'll wish they never tried. If you're going to do it, do your research, ask people, don't just kind of go in blind and do what you think is right because you're probably wrong. That's maybe not the most encouraging message, but it will matter to people. It will matter to people, and it will be, if you get it right, people will think, wow, it's really cool that they got it right. And don't joke about it, because Yahtzee Croshaw has already done that for you. He's covered it. And it was bad, and nobody really. I think he lost a lot of fans for that. And Gabe didn't joke about it, but he said some really awful things. So that's one thing. It kind of leads on to gendered pronouns. In your user interface, in your documentation, in your README, on your website, avoid the generic he, because it's really bad. It excludes 51% of all people. And I put proven by science, and that's not just a joke. People have done psychological studies to see what people associate with when they what people first associate with when they see the generic he in text, and it's always a man. Surprise. So he/she is kind of better, or even alternating between he and she at random. But one, it's kind of effort, and it's kind of clumsy, and it excludes people outside the gender binary. Generic they is grammatically correct, and it excludes nobody. And I really like grammar, so if you want to argue with me about that, go ahead.
Jamie got called a grammar Nazi by the Guardian's grammar editor.
That did happen.
That's impressive.
Yeah, they're like the chief pedant of the Guardian called me a pedant. So even if it weren't, what's worse, being wrong or excluding and marginalizing people, right? I would much rather be a little bit iffy on the grammar than upset a load of people, right? I mean, that should be a no-brainer. Z and here are alternative generic or genderless pronouns. They are he and she, he, she, or her, his, respectively. And I don't particularly think it's a good idea to use these generically. People do. But the problem is, if you'd never seen these before, you would not know what was going on. You'd think it was a typo. It hasn't really caught on, but using the generic they to refer to individuals can be a bit weird, and people will have their own preferences about how you should refer to them if they are genderqueer or otherwise don't fit on the gender binary, and you should respect those people's wishes. That's pretty much all I have to say there. A friend of mine had a really good idea. I think it's a really good idea. Maybe people will disagree. So if your game, maybe it's a story game, you know, text narrative or whatever, if it has third-person pronouns referring to the player, ask them to just tell you in text boxes what they want those pronouns to be, or put it in a menu screen.